Hello, and thank you for joining Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. My name is Ashley Burrell. I'm the Secretary of the Board for Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security. We will be producing monthly podcasts featuring women of color in the peace and security field, so please visit WCAPS.org regularly for more details.
Okay, I'd like to welcome all of you to another podcast for the Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security in our Vive series. My name is Bonnie Jenkins. I am the founder and executive director of WCAPS. And it's really a great honor for me to have these podcasts with these amazing women who've done so much and accomplished so much, and who are really inspiration to both young and old for what they've done. So it's my honor to welcome Elmira Bayrasli, who's going to talk a little bit about what she's done in the area of foreign policy, peace, security, and it's really my honor to speak with her and introduce her to you, for those of you who may not know her. So I'd like to start with Elmira. Just introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and a little bit of your background.
Bonnie, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be talking to you and to your audience here. I think it's so important to have so many different voices talking about foreign policy, particularly women. And a little bit about me. I am the co-founder and CEO of an organization called Foreign Policy Interrupted, which is very much focused on increasing female voices, contributing to foreign policy discussions in the media, on a government level, in academic circles, just to make sure that we are getting a multi-dimensional perspective on the multitude of foreign policy issues that we have. I came to do that from having 2 decades of experience working for the State Department, working for a multilateral organization in Bosnia-Herzegovina right after that war ended in the 1990s, and then working with entrepreneurs all over the world. In 2015, I published a book called From the Other Side of the World, Extraordinary Entrepreneurs, Unlikely Places, which looked at the rise of high growth, high impact entrepreneurs worldwide.
Great. And just that introduction, there's a number of things I'd love to ask you a little about in more detail. Could you say a little bit about what you did when you were at State Department?
Sure. I had just graduated. I had gotten a graduate degree from Columbia University, and I started answering phone calls for Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And I have to say, it goes to show you that hard work actually does pay off, because she took me under her wing and made me a member of her staff. And I joined her in Washington, D.C. and was part of the team working for the first female Secretary of State.
That's so exciting. Yeah, I have a similar story where I was brought back into government because I had left for a while. I was in government in the 90s, and I really returned not only because President Obama was coming in and being sworn in, but also because Secretary Clinton reached out to me. And so it was great working for her, and I had hoped that we would have our first female president, but that didn't happen.
I know, very disappointing.
Hopefully in the future. Yes. So tell us a little bit more about what you did in Bosnia when you were there.
Well, I went off to, so the story of how I actually came to Bosnia is after I left the State Department in 2000, I came back to New York, which is where I'm from and my family lives, and which is where I currently live now. And I worked in the private sector for about 18 months, but I have to tell you that after having a career working on the front line of foreign policy issues, I had FOMO big time. And it was one of those things where working on private sector, even though I was making 5 times the salary I was at the State Department, it just wasn't something that I got excited about getting out of bed in the morning to do. And I was looking around, and I had gone on an election observer mission to Kosovo in 2000 and knew about the OSCE from there. And I started digging around on the OSCE's website, and there were a couple of job openings at their mission in Sarajevo. And that's how I ended up in Sarajevo, first as the executive assistant to the head of mission, who was an American ambassador, Bob Beecroft. And then the position of chief spokesperson opened up, and I applied for it. And for 3 years, I dealt with 3 different media organizations, Serb, Croat, and Bosniak, and it was a tremendously interesting experience.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. I love how you said that you were making about 5 times as much as in government. I've
Yeah,
been in
I
government all
was.
my life. I like that. Sounds really tempting. So, so then you say a little bit about your book, and the book that you wrote. It sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I got into foreign policy is as the daughter of immigrants from Turkey. I was always made aware of the world outside of Brooklyn, New York. And, obviously, I have a different name and I have a different culture and we spoke a different language at home, but we'd also go on summer vacations to Turkey to visit my mother's family who still lives in Turkey. Um, and it was always kind of this experience where I was going into a different world and seeing, this is a place that my parents truly love, and it really was very hard for them to leave. And I could see how it pained, especially my mother, to come back to the United States. And I always thought, well, why? Why did they leave if it's so painful for them? And, the realization that I came to is that there were no economic opportunities for my parents. My parents are not college educated, and in Turkey at that time there were just no job opportunities. And so one of the reasons I got into foreign policy was, how do you actually make places like Turkey work? How do you actually create jobs in these places? How do you make them function so that families don't have to leave for better opportunities? And so when I landed at this organization working with entrepreneurs around the world, what I found is what you really needed to do is focus in on those individuals building businesses, but who weren't able to scale them up. And I was finding so many different entrepreneurs around the world who were doing exactly that, who were building high scale ventures that were creating lots of jobs and bringing in investments in their communities, but we weren't talking about them. And what I wanted to do was not necessarily write a how-to business book on how to set up a business, but talk about the importance of how business contributes to global development and social mobility. And what I did was I found entrepreneurs in 7 different countries, and I looked at how they were doing it. And essentially how they were doing it was they were overcoming obstacles that were really preventing them from replicating the Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg stories, and showing that it was possible to build a high impact, high scalable, investment worthy venture, whether you were in Mexico, Turkey, Nigeria, India, Russia, or China. And I even went to Pakistan. I have a chapter in Pakistan about my book. And it really tells the story about how economics, startups, and foreign policy are all interconnected.
I like that. I like looking at how all of those are connected, because I think that's a great story to tell. Not only I like that you looked at the issue of how do you scale up, because that is important. It's not just how you start, but how you build. And so much of what success is how you actually build up what you start. But making those connections with foreign policy, I think, is very important.
Absolutely. And I think that there is a connection. I think that there's this fallacy that, everybody stays in their lanes and then foreign policy people just look at policy. I mean, I think we're seeing in today's world that all of those things are contingent upon one another and they bleed into one another. And I think it's even more important for us to actually make those connections in order to solve the global challenges that we have.
I totally agree with you on that one. I mean, we could talk forever on that idea, because I really think that's something that the next generation really needs to really embrace, since they're the ones that's going to be dealing with so many of these very serious global issues, environmental issues, and we have to start thinking about better ways to address them. And that really does mean not, getting out of the box and work with others to try to figure out the different ways to try to resolve some of these things. So I totally agree with that. So you're from New York. I mean, you're from New York. I'm from the Bronx, so it's nice to hear you're from Brooklyn.
All right.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and you're still there in Brooklyn, or you're in New York City, or where are you now?
Yeah. I'm still a Brooklyn girl.
Oh, great. Okay, well, I'll have to see you because I go there very often.
Oh, I'd love that. Absolutely.
So, so you told us a little bit about how your interest in foreign policy, which is great. Are you happy with the field you've chosen? Are you happy that you focus most of your attention and most of your time in your career in foreign policy issues?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said, even when I left government in 2000 and I was making all of this money, um, the allure of actually working on issues that affect people's lives, trying to solve global challenges, that's something that I'm really interested in. Making them lots of money is certainly, it's certainly nice. But at the end of the day, you really do need, you need something that's going to excite you, that's going to, get you out of bed in the morning and make what you're doing meaningful. And for me, that's always been about connecting with people from all over the world, from addressing these issues. And I think particularly, it's not just about making the policy in Washington. I think for me, it's even more important to be out in the field, because you really do get to see challenges and the impact of what those problems and what the solutions are firsthand. When I was in Bosnia, I was always amazed at how a lot of these decisions were coming out of Washington and London and Paris, and they didn't really understand the realities on the ground. And when we would tell them that, well, that's not really going to work, there was a lot of pushback. But I also think that being in the field, but also connecting with people, is so vitally important. And this is also going back to the work that I'm doing today with Foreign Policy Interrupted. Today's global challenges are so vast and so numerous that we can't just rely on single policies to address them. What we really need to do is get people engaged and get people working on them. And that's not going to happen in the oak panel rooms at the State Department. That's actually going to happen in, when you're on the ground in Nigeria, when you're in Pakistan, when you're in Sri Lanka, when you're in China. And we have to actually start to realize that the people in these countries really do matter. And they actually contribute not only to global prosperity, but to global security and peace.
Right. And that is such an important point. And, getting folks in DC, and I guess in other capitals, to understand it is always a challenge. But I think we have, with the next generation and going out and helping others to understand that, I think is going to be very, very vital for the future. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Foreign Policy Interrupted and what you're doing there now?
Sure. So started in 2014. It was just an idea where we thought, well, why do we continue to have these discussions about where are the women? Continually seeing lists of experts in Middle East, Israel, China, national security, and they're all male dominated. And one of the issues that we found is that the media really, isn't aware of the talent that is out there. And so one of the impetuses of setting up Foreign Policy Interrupted was to be a resource for media outlets, newspapers, journalists, bookers, producers, editors, and really helping them identify the people, the women who are working on these issues, but also to be a resource for women who, frankly, this is where I disagree with a lot of, the common belief that women aren't confident and women have to raise their hands or they have to quote unquote lean in. It's not enough, and this is where I do agree with Michelle Obama. It's not enough for us to lean in. We don't have the incentives that allow us to raise our hand, because when we raise our hand, we get punished. The reality is that when women actually do raise their hands and volunteer and lean in, they're either ignored, they're humiliated, they're harassed, they're threatened. The incentives aren't there. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was, how do you actually get women to change their mindset and actually really realize that not only is it not them, that it's the institutions and this, the way that we've actually all been brought up to believe that, white men are the authority, and that it's not up to us to actually change it. We all have to, as a collective of society, break down these frameworks, just like Me Too is doing, right? In the same way that Me Too has actually shed a spotlight on power and sexual harassment and the role of men and women in the workplace. We actually have to also understand that if women aren't raising their hands, it's not because they lack confidence, it's because there's something wrong with the system. and then also to provide women with the tools so that when they are actually called on to be able to go on MSNBC or Fox or CNN and to be able to not only interject with their substantive points, but to also then fight back anybody who is interrupting them or who is mansplaining to them. And so what we do is we provide op-ed training workshops, how do you pitch editors, and we do media trainings. And I'm actually getting ready to break that out and to actually expand it further beyond foreign policy with an organization that I'm calling Interrupter.
And what is that organization?
It's called Interrupter, so it'll just be an expanded version of FPI.
Okay. And so do you also include like a list of people who media can go to for some background information on these issues? You have women who are ready to go out there and talk and speak. Do you keep a list of that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so on the website, the FP Interrupted website, we have experts lists, and right. I try to keep them updated regularly by topic area. So if you take a look, we have a list on national security defense. We've got a list most recently, since Yemen has been in the news a lot, we've got a list of experts in Yemen, China, Iran, and on a whole array of both geographic areas, but then also topical areas that are resources, I think, not just for the media and for journalists to use, but also for organizations who are putting together a panel, an event, or conference, and are looking for different voices to come and actually discuss these issues. I think especially what's been disappointing in this age of Twitter, 24/7 news coverage, and Facebook, and us being digitally connected, is that we're actually not seeing organizations tap into these resources and actually engage in different conversations. I'm tired of listening to the same people have the same conversations, these same predictable conversations. Let's hear from people we haven't heard from. Let's expand and enrich the discussion, because the reality is when you get more perspectives, you're actually going to get to better solutions.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I'm so tired of hearing the same, like you said, hearing the same people. And a lot of these media outlets like CNN and others have people who they, I guess, are contracted, who they always go to on a regular basis on issues. The problem with that is it's always the same people. And
it's not interesting.
No, it's not. And it's like after a while, you already kind of get a sense of what they're going to say.
Right.
And I understand why it's good for them to have these people who they know they can talk to and be reliable to talk to on a regular basis because they've had them before. But on the other hand, it does make it boring. It does make it, okay, they say the person's name and say, all right, I kind of got a sense of what this person's going to say already. So you don't really want to listen. But I'm glad to hear about the list. I know that my organization also has a list. It's not really related to media coverage or for people to do media, though that's of course something they could do. It's also for bringing women of color out there to people can see who's out there, and just to get rid of the concept that there aren't a lot of women of color out there who can speak on certain issues, and also with and hoping to help them with the media as well. So glad to hear that that's something that you have there.
Yeah, and as a woman of color, I have to say I really am very conscientious about making sure that those lists are not just are not just one-dimensional. I think it is so important to actually have ethnic and racial diversity in these conversations. So it's not just about having women at the table, but it's also about having different people from different backgrounds at the table. It's profoundly important. And I have to tell you, as a woman of color growing up here in the United States, being in particularly, I think the challenge for people of color in foreign policy is that you do get pigeonholed into certain areas. So because my parents are from Turkey, I always get pigeonholed into things that relate to Turkey, which I'm happy to because I care about the country. Obviously, I know about it, but I don't think that I should be pigeonholed. Like, I have expertise beyond that, and I want to actually be able to engage in discussions that relate to economics and global trade, because I also know a lot about those things too. And so, I think in the same way that we don't actually think twice about a white man engaging in a discussion, whether it's about Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, or China, we should also not limit people of color to whatever racial identity that they have.
Exactly. And so let's shift a little bit here. I'd like to spend the rest of the conversation on some of these other issues about being a woman and a woman of color in this area. So you already started to say a few words about this just now. And so tell us in the audience a little bit more about some of the challenges that you think you faced, continuing on what you've been saying, as a woman of color in this field of foreign policy, particularly in some areas that's so predominantly white male. Some of the challenges you've experienced, and also maybe the second part would be, how have you overcome some of those challenges?
I think the challenges that I've personally faced is just I think that there's a lot of unconscious bias there. First of all, I don't think anyone's ever going to say, Elmira, you're not welcome in this discussion, or we don't want to hear from you. Sure, I get invited to the panels, I get invited to speak at certain things, but I can definitely tell that there's a certain lack of trust at the things that I'm saying. There's a lot of questions. People will question my analysis over a white man, say, particularly on topics that, like on a topic like Turkey. I'll be on a panel with two white men who don't speak Turkish, and yet I'll be the one who is doubted. And I speak Turkish and speak to people in Turkey all the time. So I think that there's a lot of unconscious bias that I think women of color, I know I have faced in terms of, well, is she really capable? Does she really know what she's talking about? And I think the way that I've overcome that is really, not allowing their doubts to become mine. Really knowing that am I perfect? No. Do I know everything? No. I know a lot. And I think that is something that I should be sharing, because it is important to engage and participate and add value to the larger discussion. So what I really try to do is, just say, their doubts shouldn't be mine. So I was listening to How I Built This with Guy Raz. And he was interviewing the woman an entrepreneur who had started human resources, Act One, Janice Bryant Howard, human resources. And she said, she's an African-American woman who started this business that's predominantly white male. And, Guy Raz asked her this question, how did you deal with people questioning you all the time? And she said, well, it was one of these things where they could say that I was a Black woman, or I was this, but it was what I answered to that made me who I am. And if I didn't answer to it, then I wasn't allowing them to win. Right.
Wow. And so what would you say? I mean, having started in the field, and going back to your time with Secretary Albright to now, would you say that there's been some, of course the challenges still exist, but where have you seen some improvement in terms of women in the field, in terms of women of color in the field, or has there been improvement?
I certainly think I don't think that I certainly think that there has been tremendous improvement since Madeleine Albright became the first female Secretary of State. I mean, certainly you're starting to see not only more women put themselves forward, but more women getting called upon. And I think that's true across the board in foreign policy. I certainly see it at the State Department and the Defense Department and the NSC. So I think, in terms of more women in senior leadership positions, that is certainly enabled. But I still think that we have a long way to go. And I think one of the traps that we can fall into and have fallen into is that because we've had 3 female secretaries of state and we've had so many women in very high power positions. I mean, and if you take a look at the Obama administration, there were lots of women at senior levels in foreign policy: Samantha Power, Susan Rice, Hillary Clinton, obviously, but then also just in his inner circle team at the NSC. And I think that there's this fallacy of like, oh, well, we've had these women, that there's also not an effort to actually promote more women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's
we've got our few now, so
right,
right, yeah,
right. So we've got, like, we filled the quota, so like our job is done here, and it's just like, no, this isn't about a quota. This is actually about getting to a better place. And getting to that better place is going to be continually engaging in bringing in that diverse voices. So it's not just about having, like, okay, how many, like, did we get 3 women? No, it's about actually bringing more in and actually having your foreign policy representative of the country that you are leading.
Exactly. And so where do you think, what would you like to see changed? You know, and you could take that question and answer it the way you see best. Where do you think the levers are in terms of how do we keep the momentum going for having women in powerful positions, let's say in government? I mean, I think some would say that maybe right now we're taking a hit for women and people of color, let's say in the government, where you're seeing more exodus and not as much few people coming in. But in foreign policy decision making, and that could be in govgovernment and in outside government, where they are the levers of foreign policy discussions, you know, how do we make that change? What do we do now to keep it going in terms of having women in senior positions?
I think that's a great question. There's a couple of different, I have a couple of different answers to that. So one is, I think we as women of color really need to make sure that we're getting our voices out there. So if you do have an op-ed idea, if you have an idea for a blog post, write it. It matters. And don't make it about yourself. Actually realize that your voice is actually contributing to helping all of us move forward. And so, you know, Bonnie, if you're out there speaking on a panel, if you're out there publishing an op-ed, it actually helps all of us collectively, because it actually does start to really chip away at those, you know, those biases that people have, and we're seen in a different light. So definitely raise your hand, go out there. If you're, you know, curious about, like, how do I pitch an editor or what's an op-ed, you know, definitely contact me. I can walk through the steps with you, but I think it's very important for us to, you know, go out there and have our voices heard. I think the second thing is also, we also have to realize, and this is where I have a lot of qualms with the Me Too movement. You know, I think that there's this sense that, you know, we've been out there, and Me Too, you know, has really shattered this this huge elephant in the room about sexual harassment and men in power and how, you know, male-female dynamics. But I don't think that we've actually addressed this issue of how women are seen, and it's and what we're actually going to do about it. And so I think what's happened is there's a certain complacency among certain women that, you know, this is a movement and we've actually been moving forward. And my question to them is, have we? I actually question that, because I think that for certain women, things might have gotten better, but I also think that it's enabled a certain segment of society to develop a certain righteousness that is excluding women of color, and really forgetting that we have additional challenges that you don't face. You know, you don't face this institutional unconscious bias and discrimination in the same way that we do. And so I think that there's this sense of, like, we've made progress and we're having this momentum, but what we're not talking about is a lot of this righteousness is also entrenching and creating greater inequalities within not only foreign policy, but, you know, in business and law and academia. And I think that's very dangerous.
I totally agree, and I could do a whole podcast just on that.
And you should, because this is something that we need to talk about.
Yes, we do, and that's something I definitely want to talk about. I've been having chats with several people about how to frame such a discussion. So, I
want to be in it.
Yeah, I'll touch base with you offline, and we can continue that conversation. I don't want to keep you much further because you've been very kind with your time. I guess just a couple more questions. If as you see young women of color who want to get into the field of foreign policy, so much of one of the reasons why I wanted to start my organization is for the young women and who may not see, the role models out there. And we're in Washington and we're familiar with other women of color who may be out there doing things and who may be running organizations like you, or, and maybe not as much in this administration, but in past administrations have seen women of color in positions, and there's still not enough of us, as you know. But if you're the young girl in a city in the Midwest or in the South or someplace that's not in a major metropolitan area, and you feel like I'm the only young girl who's interested in this and I don't have role models. I mean, and that person comes to you and they feel very challenged because they don't see the role models and they happen to see you. And they want to know, what do I do? And how do I, and you can tell that this person, this young woman just needs to know that she can do it. And that, and she may seem like the only one out there like herself, but that there are other people who have made it and that she can do it. What do you tell that? What do you tell that young girl?
Well, I tell that young girl that she's doing the right thing of reaching out and trying to find people that she can turn to, not only for guidance, but for just that connection to have. Look, I don't think any of us have gotten to the places where we've gotten without connecting with other people. And I think it's profoundly important for whoever it is to be out there and trying to make those connections. I get emails all the time from young students, people who want to chat, and I always take the time to do that, especially if they're people of color, because I know that they, like you said, they don't have the role models and they don't have those networks. And so I think a message that I have for the women like ourselves is say yes. Shonda Rhimes, it's your year of saying yes. Always say yes to having a conversation with a young person of color, a young woman of color. Let that person know that you are available for them, that if they email you, you're going to email them back, that you can take them for coffee. It matters. And it does help them in their confidence, in their ability to continue to pursue the things that they're really interested in. And for those young women out there, keep reading, keep being curious, and keep finding those role models. I mean, I have to say that, again, I got to where I am because people took the time to talk to me. But I also, I went out there and I asked the questions, and it was hard. It's always just like, oh, is this person going to think I'm stupid? Is what I'm asking, is that strange? No question is stupid. No question is strange. Just go out there. And I think it's really important to actually go out there and make those connections.
Great. Thank you for that. And I think that's excellent advice. And one last question is, as I say a little bit about my organization, I mentioned that, trying to, encourage and empower young women and to get more mid-career women who are in this field of color, who of color in this field, get them out into the sunlight and not be hidden figures, and to work in institutions that are not as diverse and not have women of color, let's say, on their panels and in their leadership roles. What would you, how do you see WCAPS, would you say the most important thing that this organization could do in this area?
I think it's being able to reach out to different women and showcase that there are a lot of us out there working in this field. I'd love to be able to team up with you and maybe do an event, and not an event not in traditional areas. Let's go find a high school, in a predominantly, mixed or ethnic neighborhood, and maybe it's never been done because people think, oh, well, those people aren't interested in foreign policy. But I can tell you, if I invited people to a discussion about certain issues in Brooklyn, I think the room would be packed. So I think it's taking what we know and knowing that people underestimate us all the time. just going out there and doing the thing that people don't expect you to do.
Right. And that sounds great. I would love to do that, particularly in Brooklyn or New York, where I used to live in Brooklyn. So give me
let's do it.
like that. That'd be great. Okay, so I want to thank you so much for doing this and taking the time to do this. I know you're busy, particularly this time of the year with the holidays and everybody trying to get things done so they can look forward to enjoying some time off. So thanks again for doing this. And I certainly want to talk offline about doing some things together. And so I'd like for folks who are listening to stay tuned for some of the things that we will do together.
That sounds great, Bonnie, and thank you for the work that you do. And it's really, I'm so happy that we had this discussion, and I'd love to tell to your listeners more to come. I definitely want to be more involved with what you're doing, and so I hope that they'll hear more from me.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for joining Women of Color, Advancing Peace and Security. Please visit WCAPS.org. That's WCAPS.org.